Thank you. I will try to get some thoughts going right away. There are 5 questions and themes that are dominating global discourse on globalization, if I can say. And I'm going to frame these here. We had a brief chat earlier. Globalization, deglobalization, or reglobalization, I think that's a very big issue for us to consider, especially at a time when there is a debate about whether dollar is losing its influence globally. Now, second point, will multipolarity grow as it does and as it is, but will it be at the cost of multilateral structures that have been built over the last few decades in the post-war world? The rise of FTAs, as you know, many of you know, India signed about 8 FTAs. Several countries are going into bilateral regional FTAs, but what does it mean for global trade structures, especially WTO? Do we see that fragmentation as negative or positive? The fracture between US and European Union versus the rise of global South alliances, because again, we see that a certain alliance between Europe and US, North America and Europe was dominating the post-war world, but we see a lot of differences, and then you see a different coalition coming together. I don't want to call it a bloc. It's nowhere near the coherence of European Union, but still you see emergence of new structures. And finally, legacy economies and growth economies. I call legacy economies in North America and Western Europe. They've reached the peak. They have very high per capita income. But you see a situation where the growth economies, where also the largest growing populations and consumers lie, how are they going to be framing the new economic order? And I think these are all linked issues. But the most important thing, and that's the subject of my new book, is about living in a weaponized world. Nearly everything that we see today is weaponized, from trade to finance to technology to digital platforms, even, I would say, mobility and talent to an extent. So I'm going to request our very eminent and experienced speakers here to share their thoughts on this and see if we can arrive at solving the problems of the world. Let's see if we can attempt to do that. But perhaps, Stephen, Professor, if I can request you to begin.
Well, I think you can tell from the title that it's both challenging and important and hard to think about. And I was trying to figure out how I think about multipolar, which implies sort of distinct entities localized in space, with globalism, right? What's a reasonable model, and can I shake some policy recommendations out of it? And I worried about this for about a day, and then I realized that this has actually been written up, not in an obscure book, but in the only book to ever win the Nobel Peace Prize. So it was written before the First World War, which is ironic, but the argument was by a man named Norman Angell, and his argument was as follows. Anybody who wants a war in order to turn a profit, which is our usual assumption, should not start the war. And why is that? Well, because all the wealth in the modern world being 1910, is about returns to trade. And if companies aren't trading freely, if one guy runs everything and tells everybody what to do, then the wealth will disappear. And he goes on about how, you know, you may look at bank vaults, but that's just paper. What's really wealth in the modern world is trade, and free trade in particular. Now that obviously turns out to be a bad theory of war, because he famously is predicting that there can no longer be wars, and within a generation you have 2 of the largest ones in human history. But on the other hand, he's not all, and by the way, some of you will know that his book is called The Great Illusion. Jean Renoir's classic movie is Grand Illusion, which is a sort of remorseful reference to this once very famous and influential book. But I wonder if the problem here is, first of all, and he said, of course, this is a rational man theory, and we could have a madman, which is a good explanation for the 2 wars, so he's not entirely wrong. But I wonder if the problem is that returns to trade aren't quite powerful enough. And I've sat through this wonderful conference, and people are basically telling me, if I got it down right, that in the world to come, power, or at least wealth, will depend on 2 things: human cleverness and sand. And there's plenty of sand, And in India, we are in the powerhouse of cleverness. That was historically held down somewhat for obvious structural reasons, but India has always supplied the outstanding tale of geniuses on the planet, any number of 20th century tales like that. So we are at a place where Angel's argument is much stronger than it ever was, and that gives me hope. But then the question is, how do we take policy implications out of that? And I'll just finish by saying, you want to make the world as simple as Angel's model, right? I mean, let's drag the world toward Angel's model. And his model was based on trade, and that's a strong argument against tariffs. And his argument was based on human cleverness and free interchange. And I will tell you, this is a discussion for another day, but intellectual property in the formal economics analysis, there are all sorts of places where you get too much and you get less discovery or discovery that isn't used. So people should be very careful before just saying any problem we need to have patent rights or stronger patent rights. That's another thing that interferes with this argument. And the last one, of course, I don't know what to do with. He's talking about materialists. There are obviously deep hatreds in the world. But to the extent we have a lever on this problem, and I do think the theory is not logically wrong, then we should be doing what policy steps we can to have human cleverness be the main source of wealth in the world, and that will be a force for peace. And Angel will be vindicated 100 years too late.
Thank you so much, Professor Maurer. Ambassador Sievers, you know, it must be exciting to be a diplomat these days, right?
I'm actually no longer a diplomat.
Yeah, but do you wish that you
were? But I
was,
yes.
Do you wish that you were, or are you glad that you were not an ambassador anymore?
Pardon me, I didn't get it.
I'm saying, are you glad that you're not an ambassador anymore, or?
I actually enjoyed being an ambassador enormously, but I think in many ways it's become more complicated.
It is.
In the last
So,
6 years.
in
Yeah.
your view, we live in a time where we find complexity at every layer. It's not a simple world of global north, global south, developing countries, developed countries kind of dynamic. In your view, when we talk about multipolarity, is that something which is being welcomed by the existing powers versus the rising powers? How do you see this shift taking place, peacefully or with a lot of friction?
Well, I think we live in a world that's full of tensions and frictions and conflict. We also live in a world that people are, technically, it's easier to connect with people around the world than it's ever been in human history. I'm still somebody who's amazed that I can, have a Zoom call with somebody in New York and somebody in, somewhere else on the planet is able to join in, and we're all speaking to each other on a screen. So that's certainly one aspect of our lives. But when we talk about globalization, I'm reminded of the period after the fall of the Soviet Union, and the sense of, Francis Fukuyama's book of the,
end of history.
I'm sorry, I'm blanking, but the end of history, where liberal democracy was going to spread throughout the world, and conflict would be a thing of the past. And of course, it hasn't turned out to be true. It was a nice idea, but we've had a very conflicted last decade or so. And I don't think that's going away. And the other thing is, I think there was a discounting of the responsibility of government to exercise sovereignty and to set the interests of its citizens as its highest priority. I think that is being reestablished, at least in the United States, and that held out as a model. But obviously, countries have to cooperate as well. They can't exist entirely on their own terms. So, but I think that some restoration of the importance of sovereignty and the obligation of states to their own citizens is something that's been that's badly needed, and that I think is a good thing.
Thank you. Professor Zhu, You know, a few years ago at Davos, I heard President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi talking about the importance of globalization. And it was very interesting because the European and the North American leaders were saying, well, we don't like what's happening with globalization. And today, in a few years later, we see more of that. It's very interesting that China and India are in favor of globalization, but the rest of the world seems to be saying, well, I think we need to change the rules. How do you see that, especially from your perspective in China?
Okay, thank you. Talking about the multipolar world, actually, in my framework of understanding in the world, there are different positions of different countries. If we define who are the polars, first you must be unique and you must be irreplaceable. And in the world, there are three roles. One is resource countries. Another one is production countries. The third one is consumption countries. So there are different countries whose roles are different. For example, America. America is the biggest power in the world, but it is also, at the same time, is the biggest production, resource, and consumption countries altogether. This is why America is most powerful in the world. The military based, behind the military is the production, right? And China, currently China is the biggest production country. And Russia is the resource country, right? And India, maybe India is the most human resource country. Therefore, in the global trade, actually, the fundamental tension among different countries means the redistribution of the interest among the global value chains. For example, European countries from the beginning, they have a monopoly of some technology, so their profit is very high, and then their workers beneficial, the higher social welfare and low production, and maybe every week they only need to work for 4 days. So that could be the high products and the high competitiveness. But now, China, India, the emerging economies, they are rising. They want to get more interest in the global value chain. Therefore, the conflicts or intention begins. Suppose there's no new technologies and the new increased total values in the world. So this is the zero-sum competition. If China and if new economies want to get more benefit, there must be some losers. For example, European countries or like American countries are sort of. Therefore, that could be the current situation. Why after the year of 2000? Because there are no fundamentally revolutionary technological development. So no economic boomers. Therefore, countries must compete with each other to get the stable benefit in the global value chain. That's the result of the current situation. And then
Professor Zhu, if I can just interrupt you quickly. You know, a few days ago in India, one of the senior US government administration officials said that they will not make the mistake with India what they made with China in terms of allowing the rise of China. It was a very strong statement saying that, in effect, allowing China to rise was a mistake, and especially from a perspective of global value chains. How do you see this statement? I mean, not just a statement, it's a thought process that, well, we allowed certain countries to rise, and we are not going to allow these. And to sort of answer that, Indian Foreign Minister said that India's rise will not depend on the mistakes of others. So there's this very large current of thought saying that any rise of any other country from outside the global north has to be controlled or contained.
First, America has never been declining. They are still in the top, at the top. The reason why China rise so fast from the beginning, from 40 years ago, because at that time, China was the biggest third party among that kind, at that time, the geopolitical system. What is that political system? Yes, Cold War. The biggest two powers, America and the Soviet Union. Then America tried to attract China to be America's friend. Then we got a honeymoon period in 1980s. Then China get a rise. Current situation, especially in India, India's position currently is China's position 40 years ago. Why? Because there are two biggest powers, China and America. Obviously, India grasped this opportunity as the third biggest, economy or population, big power, and either side, either big power, want to attract India as a friend. This is a strategic competition between the two big powers. So India has now the opportunity to rise. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Professor Manchanda, you study societies. And I think one of the big pushback to globalization is coming from Western societies. We feel that they are not benefiting anymore. And interestingly, the societies of the growth economies feel that, well, there is a lot to go ahead for. Now, what kind of dynamics do you see in societies in terms of challenging existing economic growth policies of legacy countries and the growth economies?
Yeah, thank you. I guess I have to ask you a little bit more maybe about what you mean by globalization. And the reason I'm asking that is when I was studying international relations 20 years ago, globalization was often pitted against the state. So there was globalization, which meant that the state was retreating or the state was growing stronger and therefore there was less globalization. What we have now is clearly not that. What we have is both stronger states, so nationalism is growing and states are asserting their power, as well as globalization, particularly when it comes to global finance and global capitalism. That is not stopping. So I guess in the West, there is some pushback to globalization, like you say, but most of that pushback is against migration or immigration. So it's the free movement of people that there's...
But that was a key tenet of globalization too.
Yes.
Talent mobility, if you look at what WTO's various rounds of discussions, mobility was a very key principle.
Absolutely. And the mobility of people is decreasing, but like I say, the mobility of capital and the mobility of finance is increasing. The other thing is that when we talk about globalization, one of the things that we often miss is that the biggest challenge we face as the human species is climate change. And climate change will affect everybody at some point, definitely not equally, but it is a global challenge, and that requires global answers and network global solutions, right? So retreating to some sort of state-centered, non-globalized world is not actually possible. And then in terms of the East versus West, question, I think, again, it's a bit more complicated because there is a multipolar or a multipolarity happening now. So the world is moving towards some sort of multipolar system, but we have had, at least since the end of the Cold War, a unipolar world. And that has also been pretty unstable, and it's been contested. But it's not just the West, right? So I think the US perhaps is, for good reason, not very happy with the way in which the world is, in the direction of the world, but it's also, in some ways, hastening its own demise. But the problem is that there's now some sort of tension between Europe and the US. And that I think, is a big problem. So far, Europe has more or less backed the US in what it's doing, but I think that will change. And whether that ultimately leads to more peace or more war, I think is still an open question. At this point, I think the world is looking very unstable. And I think there need to be major changes afoot for us to go back to focusing on the big questions. And the tagline of this summit, for instance, is for all humankind. And as long as we think of all humankind, the questions we ask of globalization or the demands we place on it look very different if we're just talking about the 1%, which we often are.
Thank you. Professor Orsi, multilateralism, we talked about the rise of China and India, but Japan actually went through the same phase in the 80s when it was rising. There was serious consternation everywhere, like, is Japan going to take over the world? But we've seen how things have developed since then. But multilateral institutions, and even today, as we see wars across the world, we see that multilateral institutions are not playing any role. I mean, that's a huge worry, that the structures that you created are effectively defunct. How do you see them being revived, if at all, in the next few years?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you for having me in this panel and for these very interesting questions about multilateralism and its future and the future of multilateral institutions. One could actually start from disputing the claim that multilateral institutions are not working towards the solution of these kind of problems. In a way, it's also a question of expectations. What can we realistically expect, let's say, from the UN, right, which is typically attacked for not being effective in its role of pacifiers and so on. But maybe we are asking also a little bit too much from those institutions. And my answer to the question would be that, yes, of course, they don't provide the kind of solution we would like to have, but we would be much worse off if we didn't have those institutions in place. So if we didn't have diplomats meeting in New York at the UN Security Council or UN Assembly, General Assembly, we would be much worse off, because at least in this fora, people can talk, and it's better than not talking at all. So I always teach my students, look, many of these theories of international politics, or let's say we discuss just war theory, what wars are just? And it turns out that no war has ever been really just according to the theory. So what's the point of having a theory of just war? Well, the point is that if we would be worse off if we didn't think at all about the ethical dimension of war. And so in the same way, I think we are better off having institutions, multilateral institutions.
So quickly, really I'm going to interrupt you, Professor Orsi. Who is going to strengthen and improve the institutions? On who does the responsibility lie?
Well, again, great question. I think institutions have their own trajectory, and the strengthening will come as a reflection of and convergence of interest of great powers to let them have more weight in international politics. So the point is really to find a convergence of interests. The institution will not work just by themselves. It's the contents that state actors bring to the institutions. After all these international organizations are really, from a legal perspective, the hypostatization, the substantiation of state will of them existing. Otherwise, they wouldn't be even there. So it takes great leadership. We need enlightened leaders who can see the opportunities that arise from enhanced forms of multilateralism. There is no way out.
I'm going to request all of you to select and choose one word. Reglobalization or deglobalization? What do you see ahead?
I'm going to be optimistic and say...
Mike.
Oh, I'm sorry, the wrong cue. I'm going to be optimistic and say reglobalization because, for the reason already stated, those make nations more secure.
Thank you. Ambassador. Re or D?
I lean toward deglobalization, but the networks of global trade and global interactions, finance, so forth, are here to stay and need to be strengthened at the same time. But I think we're going to see more assertion of national interests around the world.
Thank you. Professor Zhu, D or Re?
I think first is I don't want to define what is globalization and deglobalization. But in my mind, during the Biden administration, the global system is isolate China outside the global trade system. But the current, the Trump administration is self-isolated outside the global trade system from America. Thank you.
So do you see deglobalization or reglobalization?
No, I mean not deglobalization.
None of the above.
Only one country was isolated by the globalized system.
Okay, got that point. Professor?
I think I'll say that we'll see a bit more globalization or reglobalization for some people and in some places, and then some quite scary deglobalization for other people in other places. So it's going to be uneven, I guess.
Thank you, Professor Orsi.
Great. I think globalization is a mega trend, and let's say in the years between the 1990s and the 2000s, we had a huge acceleration. That's why we had the whole debate on globalization. And probably there's been some excesses, or some people are losers of this particular aspect of globalization, around the globalization. So it's natural that someone wants to push back. But I think in the long term, if these problems are solved, then there will be re-globalization, maybe a more balanced one.
Thank you so much. And please join me in thanking our panelists and speakers. This is a thought for all of you. Will we go for deglobalization or reglobalization? Think on it, and there'll be many more debates to come. Thank you so much for joining us today.